Thank you for coming to this month's meeting of the branch of the BCS. Can I have a quick show of hands of who's a member? Oh, good. Who's not? I'll come and see you later. For those who are not a member of the BCS, we're a professional body supporting people who work in IT. We promote professionalism and prod governments about policy and trying to do the right thing to make IT better for society. If you want to join us, great. If you don't, it's fine as well. All our events in Edinburgh are free if we can do it. I'm trying to find out more, bcs.org. If not, doesn't matter. We just do this out of the goodness of our own hearts. Tonight, our goodness of our own hearts exercise is going to be with Matthew on box burnout and blame. Matthew's worked in IT for decades.
Yeah.
And has now decided to transition to the startup world, helping organisations and people grow and innovate. So, over to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much. I have a question for you all. Have you ever felt like this? Every day is a struggle. You feel exhausted, but you can't sleep properly. You just about hang on until Friday afternoon, but the dread of Monday morning spreads across the whole weekend, so you can never relax. Worse, you're starting to feel ill. You have a headache all the time and your digestion isn't working so well. You feel trapped. It's hard to care about anything much at all. If this sounds familiar, you could be experiencing burnout. Burnout happens when you have a demanding role, but your needs aren't met by what you do. It's a combination of your personal circumstances and the way a workplace is structured. Tonight, we're going to talk about how you can work more effectively, find flow and avoid burnout. We're going to talk about how we as IT professionals can build better organisations which foster creativity and growth, not exhaustion. Before we get to solving burnout, it's helpful to think about what causes it in the first place. Burnout comes from a misalignment between your environment, your goals, and how you're trying to achieve them. These are some of the major risk factors. Lack of control, particularly over things that my toxic environment may be your ideal workplace. It's also something which can be endured for relatively short periods of time just to get something done. However, if the situation doesn't improve or you don't take control and improve things yourself, then you can end up stuck in a negative cycle. The good news is that it's possible to break this cycle. For your work to be satisfying, it must be meaningful. For it to be meaningful, it must be aligned with your values. Doing work which you find satisfying can be the single factor between going home at the end of the day feeling that you've achieved something and going home at the end of the day feeling that you've been banging your head against a wall. For me, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche summed this up well. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. In a recent study, researchers found that having most important values. I'll give you a few seconds. I'm sorry, it's a mean thing to do. The odd thing about values is that they can be very, very hard to bring to mind. They're hidden most of the time. They're just part of the way that we think. We only really notice them when they're challenged in some way. Slightly misaligned values better protected from burnout. One reason doing something you believe in helps is that you're more able to engage your whole brain in the task. When you do something you're not really sure about, a bit of your brain is always checking for something more rewarding. That could be you're constantly distracted by task after task, never being able to complete any single one of them. This is one of the reasons why lack of control is such a risk factor for burnout. Getting a stream of unpredictable, urgent tasks is tough to manage. Switching between them, constantly trying to triage, never really solving any of them, is extremely stressful. If all this seems a little daunting, and if you're on the way to burning out, it probably does, then there are tools to help. A key way of managing burnout is to make sure that you get a source of satisfaction and enjoyment. However, it can be tough to decide what you really want to do. It can be even tougher to convince your colleagues that this is a good idea. They said, dress for the job you want, not the job you have. Now, I'm sitting in a disciplinary meeting wearing a Batman outfit. So, how do you know what work you really should be doing? How do you know what's actually worth struggling for? One way is to look at what you find the most rewarding. There are two different types of personal reward that we can get from work. The first we've already spoken about. It's when you make the world better in a way that aligns with your values. The second is the pleasure that we get from actually doing the task. That's what we're going to talk about next. In his book Flow, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talks about the deep pleasure people experience when fully immersed in a task. Think back to a time when you were working on something and time just passed by. It felt completely effortless and automatic. You were completely absorbed in what you were doing. And when you look back, you've been performing at your best. This is a flow state. Can you remember a time when you've experienced this? What were you doing? People often give the examples of playing music, playing sport, or playing computer games as times that they've experienced a flow state. For most people, flow is a really rare event at work. There's no strong reason that this should be so. People with traditional working lives, such as farmers and hunters, regularly report being in flow. So do people with practical professions, such as surgeons. Some IT people do report flow, usually whilst programming, particularly solving a particularly difficult problem. You see, it's not the category of work we're doing that determines whether we can reach this state of effortless productivity. It's the qualities of the task itself and the work environment. The first thing necessary for flow is that the task has a clearly defined, self-set goal. This must be achievable by the end of the work session. It helps if that goal contributes to a bigger, meaningful picture too. The next thing is that feedback must be immediate and tangible. You need to see yourself making progress towards the goal for flow to continue. Finally, the work must be difficult enough to be challenging, but not so difficult that it becomes frustrating. There's a sweet spot of difficulty where we perform at our best. This is the Yerkes-Dodson law, a psychology theory which maps task performance to emotional arousal. There's a peak on the curve where we're performing at our best. It's neither complete relaxation nor blind panic, but somewhere in between the two. As you get better at a task, the sweet spot moves to the right. You need more pressure to perform well at something you're already good at. You can use the environment to give you any extra pressure that you need. Social commitments, for example, can be really strong motivators. If you want to get something done, make a hard-to-break commitment. You could, for example, offer to give a talk to your local BCS branch. Another good way to give yourself the pressure you need is to create imminent deadlines. Have you ever wondered why it's hard to worry about things in the far future, but comparatively minor things in the near future can seem absolutely terrifying? The more distant the deadline, the less we care, because of a bias called hyperbolic discounting. You see, we don't have a linear relationship with the future. Things, even very serious things, that are a long way off, are very easy to ignore. To deal with this, break a task up into chunks which are small enough to be achievable in a relatively short space of time. That way, you'll have feedback about your progress and imminent deadlines. This, along with being well rested, can make flow much more likely. The thing is, similar to falling asleep, you can't make flow happen directly. All you can do is set the circumstances which it's more likely to happen. Once it does happen, the last thing you want is for that flow to be interrupted. Distractions can be hugely disruptive to flow. Many tasks require complex mental models to be built up before any progress can be made. Distractions cause these models to be forgotten. Mental models are fragile things. Like a spider's web, they can be swept away at a single stroke. It's much harder to build that model a second time. Our brains prefer novelty, and therefore following that path that second time is far less engaging than following it the first time through. Because it's less compelling, returning to flow becomes that much less likely. Take steps to manage distractions. Many open plan offices use the headphone rule, in which people wearing headphones shouldn't be distracted. You don't need to respond to emails immediately after they arrive either. Phone notifications are a particularly pernicious distraction. Many applications are designed to capture your attention. This is in the interest of the vendor. They get more application usage, but it isn't in your interest. If you do nothing else as a result of this talk tonight, please go through your phone and turn off as many notifications as possible. Be brutal, and remember, you can always turn them back on again if you need to. In IT, we have another occupationally specific distraction problem. We work at a computer for much of the day. That means we have the most useful, yet the most distracting thing ever created right at our fingertips: the internet. Worse, we can't really turn it off because we need it to do our jobs. As technology pioneer Mitch Kapor said, getting information off the internet is like taking a drink from a fire hydrant. There are some tools which can help. They block specific websites according to a preset schedule. Once they don't solve the problem completely, they do start to break the habit of mindless distraction. They allow you to make a conscious choice instead of just clicking through quizzes and listicles for a half hour. You'll likely get by not knowing what piece of IKEA furniture you are. And yes, this is indeed a real quiz. In case you were wondering, I'm the Opland bed. If you can focus on single tasks, take regular breaks and remove distractions, you'll have achieved a lot more by the end of the day. You'll be less tired and more ready to do your best the following day. You're setting yourself up for success. You will both protect yourself from burnout and increase your chances of finding flow. The thing is, if you struggle, you shouldn't take it as a personal failing. There are limits to what you can do on your own. A lot of the advice I've given so far is focused on controlling your environment. A lot of that environment is dictated by the organisation that you work for. This is not always a good thing. The desire to control staff behaviour is at the root of many self-destructive management decisions. The problem is, frontline staff know best how to do their jobs. Modern workplaces are complex systems built upon complex systems. They defy straightforward command and control. Frequently, IT is the vehicle of such policies too, even if it's not the originator. We suffer the reputational hit when we fail to stand up for our users. We need to deliver systems which allow for the unexpected. A prescriptive system prevents staff from responding to unanticipated events. Let's take an IT service desk as an example. The goal of the service desk is to resolve technical issues as quickly and efficiently as possible. The problem is, not every user is calling because they have a technical issue in need of resolution. Some of them are calling because using a computer makes them feel stupid and they want to feel better about themselves. Others are calling because they failed to do a piece of work that they should have and they need an excuse. If you focus purely on technical resolution, you won't meet these needs. If you have a ticket closure target with a mandatory conversation flowchart, staff have no opportunity to solve the problem that the user actually has. Support teams are not only prevented from winning, they're prevented from playing the right game in the first place. This is stressful for all involved. If you don't have a mechanism to detect that something has gone wrong, then the organisation cannot improve. This is a particular problem for tightly coupled processes like car manufacturing. The Toyota production method has a solution. It's called the and-on cord. The and-on cord runs the length of the production line within easy reach of all workers. Staff are trained to pull the cord if they spot anything wrong with the car that they're working on. When they pull the cord, the line immediately stops and a supervisor attends to see what the problem is. The very first thing that supervisor does is thank the employee for pulling the cord. This might seem like an odd thing to do. Each pull of the cord costs thousands of pounds in lost productivity, and depending on the stage of manufacturing, could potentially ruin the whole car. The thing is, employees know that. They know that in pulling the cord, they risk angering both their bosses and their colleagues on the line. By thanking them, the supervisor emphasises that it's more important to fix the systematic issue than it is to plough on and finish the car that they're working on. Once the issue is fixed, production continues until the next time the cord is pulled. It's only worth going to all this effort if the issue is fixed after it is raised. That means that the organisation has to be prepared to change in response to what it finds. There's one particularly large barrier to change in organisations, and that's blame. Why is blame so harmful to progress? 2 reasons. The first is that it prevents problems from being raised. Instead, they're just swept under the carpet, where they quietly accumulate. The second reason is because blaming individuals rarely gets to the root of the problem. The management consultant, W. Edwards Deming, said a bad system will beat a good person every time. His research suggested that 94% of performance belonged to the system, not the individual. That means if you have a blame culture, you're only going to be getting to the root cause 1 in every 17 times you look. That's a poor strike rate. One of the reasons blame cultures persist is because blaming an individual is, at least in the short term, the easy thing to do. As humans, we have a bias towards explaining things in terms of the intrinsic qualities of a person. We tend to overlook the systematic environmental effects on behaviour. That colleague who won't help you isn't stressed and overworked. They're arrogant and mean. That person who cut you off in traffic this morning isn't inattentive because they're going through a difficult period in life. They're just an arse. Whenever an organisation adopts the metric of fewest mistakes, it's likely to generate a blame culture. Mistakes are always going to happen when doing complex work. It's obviously a good thing to minimize mistakes, but that's a second order effect. You need to build processes which give rise to fewer mistakes. Otherwise, you're just blaming staff for something that they have no control over. And again, that's something we know causes burnout. Blame can be really hard to eradicate from a workplace. It can manifest in subtle ways. Even if the organisation doesn't punish people directly, if the only people considered for promotion are those without a mistake attributed to them, then the effects are just the same. The management theorist Simon Sinek describes the role of leadership as creating a circle of safety. Within the circle are members of the organisation. The older parts of our brain interpret this as our tribe. If we feel secure in the tribe, we can take risks. We know that others will look out for us. We know that if things go wrong and we make a mistake, we won't become an outcast. If we're inside the circle of safety, we can spend our energy on productive work. We can look to the outside world and make valuable changes for others. If we're outside that circle, perhaps it only extends to a privileged clique of senior managers, then things are very, very different. We have to spend all our energy maintaining our position and protecting ourselves. We can't do anything for other people when we're busy fighting for our own survival. One major threat to staff feeling safe at work is performance measurement. In a complex organisation, it can be extremely difficult to assess employee performance. This is even harder when the value of work that people are doing is abstracted or there's significant teamwork. This difficulty can result in some dubious measurement techniques. The worst of these, particularly if it's the sole metric, is hours worked. No man goes before his time unless the boss leaves early. Groucho Marx. We need to build our metrics based on genuine contribution. Failing to do this sets up perverse incentives and undermines morale. Measuring performance by just logging time in chair is disastrous. This task seems even harder when managing agile teams, and it becomes harder still when those teams are distributed all over the world using cutting-edge technology to collaborate.
Ask a question.
Yeah.
So you said it shouldn't be the time you should make a contribution. Based on the fact that what you said about process, is there something where we should really be measuring things like effort rather than contribution? Because if you've got high level of effort, a poor process, then you wouldn't necessarily materialise that as a high level of productivity.
Yeah,
I know it's hard to measure efforts, but
it's very, very hard to measure employee productivity at all. Partly because in a modern organisation, you're really hiring experts, domain experts, and those domain experts are going to know more necessarily than anyone else about their domain of expertise. So working out what's right, what's wrong, where there's been mistakes, where there's been errors, is extraordinarily hard. From my perspective, it's a relatively unsolved question. I don't think there's a good answer to a perfect answer to measuring employee productivity. It's a mixture of different things. There are also some very intangible things like contribution to culture and contribution to teamwork that are hugely effective, but that are almost unmeasurable. So, yeah. If you work in an organisation with any aspirations towards being agile, you probably know Slack. It's a real-time, persistent chat tool. It has multiple channels in which people can discuss whatever they need. If you're of a certain vintage, it'll probably remind you of IRC. It's a great way to improve collaboration. Slack is really popular with remote teams. However, managing remote teams is hard. A lot of the conventional approaches to management just don't work. if you've got teams spread out all over different time zones. You can't rely on the kind of in-person interaction that you normally would. Worse, it can be extremely difficult to get a handle on things if issues start to arise and things start to go wrong. The Startup Compass provides visualization of the way people work together in Slack. This is the kind of diagram that it produces. It can measure how different people talk to one another and the sentiment of those conversations. This gives management insight into differences between the way the org chart looks and the way that people are really working. This kind of information can be used to identify bottlenecks and key person dependencies. It can be used to see how conversations changes over time and across different projects. It can be used to check that interactions are productive and even psychologically safe. Compass presents much of its data as a network graph. In the graph we saw the nodes are individual employees. The real value of a network graph is that it shows the relationship between nodes, not just the attributes of the nodes themselves. When you look at data this way, you can see the features of the whole system. You have insight into the way the whole network works. It's not just the way that people chat in Slack, which can be understood as a network. Any large, hard-to-understand set of data can benefit from this kind of analysis. It's used by insurance companies who look out for unusual links between claimants to uncover fraud. It's used by Netflix, who, based on your previous viewing and your demographic data, will predict what you might want to watch next. One decision when mapping a network is to choose what relationship to show. If we're focusing on people, then the tone of communication is very revealing. The way something is said matters at least as much as the data conveyed in the speech. Sentiment analysis assesses the emotional content of language. Most often it's used to measure the positivity and negativity, the emotional valence of the language. One very successful use of this approach is a Brighton-based company called Brandwatch. They use social media they track social media to help companies understand the way that their brand is perceived online. Determining the emotional content of natural language is far from straightforward. It requires the ability to understand context and of the relevant emotional words. To do this, you need to break sentences down into components, and only then can you start to assess the relationships between them. There's one area of AI which has focused on natural language particularly, and that's chatbots. You might have seen Google Duplex in the news. It's one of the most sophisticated chatbots out there. It can have a spoken conversation in real time. And now I'll just play you a demo that was at Google I/O earlier in the year.
What you're going to hear
Okay, so despite the impressiveness of this clip, Duplex is actually fairly limited. You know, this is a tech demo. As well as booking a hair appointment, it can book a restaurant. It can do a handful of linear tasks in good conditions. It can't deal with the unexpected, and it can only speak in English. Why should this be so? To understand what makes building an effective chatbot so challenging, let's take an imaginary one apart to see how it works. This bot is used to book airline tickets. When it receives a statement, the bot first has to determine intent. Does the user want to ask about routes, flight times, or confirm a booking? You could do this by looking for specific statements, but that would mean that the user has to guess exactly what to say. Most bots therefore use machine learning to look at likely statements and then classify what the real intent is. Next, the bot has to pick out specific terms that the user is talking about, the entities. If the user says, tell me about flights to Edinburgh on the 14th of June, then it needs to spot the destination and the date so that it can make the right search. Once it's done that, it can return the correct response. The problem is, human speech is an untidy thing. It's full of subclauses, interruptions, and dangling modifiers. Not only that, but people switch topic between sentences. Sometimes people switch topic in the middle of sentences. How is a bot supposed to keep up? Many bots use a nested dialogue structure. The bot talks about the most recent task that the user has mentioned, finishes that, then goes back to what it was talking about before. In our example, after asking about flight availability, the next question could be, what are the food options? On hearing that, the bot starts a food selection dialogue. After that, it returns to the timing of the flight. Even this approach, though, doesn't capture the full flexibility of natural speech. You can start to see why Duplex has to be so focused on specific tasks. Any increase in scope comes with a huge number of possibilities to design for. It's a huge engineering challenge. It's easy for us to take speech for granted. We do it so naturally. The thing is, we've had a lot of practice. We can design AI and bots which do the same and practice. By building bots with feedback and learning mechanisms, they can get better every time. They can classify a wider range of statements and they can do so more reliably. There's exciting work going on in this area. It combines the network analysis that we looked at earlier with natural language processing. As this kind of machine learning becomes more sophisticated, it will have more and more applications. We're finally reaching the point at which AI can perform like a human, at least in narrow tasks. We're at the point where natural language interfaces are the best choice for some services. The real power, though, comes from the ability to learn from experience. Outcomes can be fed back into machine learning algorithms, improving performance with each interaction. It's this ability to learn and respond to their users which will give new workplace tools their value. In IT, we can support direct human-to-human transactions at scale. We can also automate some of those transactions. Organisations can then become force multipliers, allowing individuals to do something far more valuable than they would on their own. The goal of IT becomes delivering friction-free, meaningful work. As IT professionals, we have a new role: empowering staff. We design the systems which people use for more and more of their work. The expectation is that we're designing technical systems, but we're implicitly designing human systems too. We must use the capability that machine learning and AI gives us to build in the interests of our users. These tools can help us build better organisations which learn and respond to the changing needs of the environment, organisations which adapt to the needs of their users, organisations which give staff space to perform at their best, be creative, and find flow. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Or
I have a question about the bots.
yeah.
About how much the building those systems, I mean, the natural language stuff, I'm sure it's, that's sort of to do with having lots and lots of examples to jump through and then eventually say, you know, whenever I hear this and this, you know, and so on and so forth, rather than being very prescriptive and somebody saying, when you hear this noise, it means this.
Yeah.
But in terms of the interaction, in terms of I'd like 12 o'clock, I haven't got 12 o'clock, I've got 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
How much of that is just prescriptively pre-coded, or does the system actually understand the context of the conversation? It's not clear to me how much of it's pre-programmed and how much of it is pure, statistics and probability, and just, through looking at 10,000 conversations, understanding that if somebody says that, then this is the right response. It's not clear to me.
Yeah. So the question is, what's the relationship between kind of training and kind of prescriptive scripting?
Yes. You asked my question much better.
I think when you're looking at something like Google Duplex, you're looking at something which has been trained across a really big data set of genuine conversations. There's a lot of the back end that's related to the same competitive machine learning algorithms that helped Google win that founded AlphaGo. I don't know if you came across AlphaGo, but Go is a Far Eastern board game that was notoriously difficult for AI because it has so many different degrees of freedom, and yet AlphaGo managed to beat I think it was the second best Go player in the world a couple of years ago. And it does that by taking two models that are complete black boxes and have trained themselves and having them learn from each other, and then having those models, then the losing model then learns from its loss and then goes back and tries again. So when you're looking at something like that, you're looking at something really, really deep. The challenge there is the vast majority of chatbots are far, far simpler than that. You can get a lot of the value of a chatbot from a relatively simple script. If you look at the scripts that humans are expected to follow in many customer service interactions, they're a lot simpler than most conversations, than some of the conversations we saw there. So yeah, it's a balance, and the more effort that you put in, the more you're going to get out. But there's got to be a business decision about how much effort you want to put in, because not every organisation has the resources that Google does. And you can write a very functional chatbot with very, very limited resources in an afternoon. If you already speak, you can already write C# or write in Node.js, for example. So yeah.
I just ask about what practices there are out there for the learning part, because we talk about running against huge amounts of data and learning that way. You talked about real-time feedback. Certainly at one of the large people involved using things like Spark and things like that to do large volume batch processing of data. Feedback is either hugely a huge level of consumption of resources, or it's something that you have to develop without knowing that you're going to tune at specific points. So I suppose I'm not up to date about where that is. I mean, how being able to, at a level of accessibility for people in this room, to be able to get to that instant feedback.
It is still about tuning. It's about having a release phase where you're tuning. It's not possible yet to have a kind of live bot that can then be talk to an end user and then get feedback directly and then change itself. I haven't seen that done yet.
Even beyond just the chatbot, just the application of machine learning in that way. It's something you pointed at at the end of your speech, and I think that's where the magic is. But
it very much is.
We're not there.
No, indeed, that's the end of the speech is hopefully laying out a future position. It's very much about that. Taking a data set, training, and then tweaking. Yeah, that's all we can do at the moment. I haven't seen any services, certainly production services, that do kind of live feedback yet, though it wouldn't surprise me if we do soon.
What was the point of the sentiment analysis in Slack? I mean, I saw something about Microsoft Workplace Analytics the other week. Quite interesting. About what do we just look forward to getting fired? Or what?
So It's an interesting question, actually. Is the amount of insight that you give management can be a potentially dangerous thing. You can give people a lot of these monitoring tools really make people very nervous for their jobs. And there's a big challenge if you're building them to make them safe for users so they don't have a chilling effect on the conversations that are happening in the organisation. But yeah, the purpose of sentiment analysis is that you've got a whole load of interactions going on in your business all the time, between colleagues, between staff and customers. So if you look at how those interactions are working and what works for the organisation, you can start to monitor the things that you do to intervene and see whether they're successful. So say you had a culture change programme because you were concerned with the culture in your organisation, you can start to monitor whether that programme is effective in a very tangible way, when previously culture change is all, just, it's very hard to measure, notoriously hard to measure.
Yeah, I noticed that when the guy was talking about how do you measure productivity, it seems to be driving towards engagement as opposed to low-grade meetings, he said. I don't really understand how they measure engagement or what they class as a low-grade meeting. It seems to be something to drive communication over their Teams, Slack.
Yeah, engagement is an interesting one, because particularly thinking about all of the metrics that we use, some people would say, if you're in a room full of coders, they'd say the best way to measure engagement is in the number of Git commits. They'd say that that's what engagement looks like. Whereas you ask a senior manager and they'll be expecting people to turn up to meetings and engage with the human side of the business. So again, it comes down to designing the organisation for what you're actually trying to achieve. One of the really difficult things about all of this is working out what people are collectively trying to achieve. There's some really interesting opportunities around understanding what the collective culture is and using that to then inform what the organisation should be doing, what opportunities it has that it didn't know it had. But that's a long way off yet.
So is your thesis in part that there's an opportunity to use machine learning on these data about interactions and behaviours and so forth to improve the systems and so forth of a particular organisation?
Yes.
And if so, don't you need a substantial amount of training data for organisations to make changes and have improved? That would kind of seem a bit of a stumbling block for organisations not necessarily giving that data.
No, this is one of the challenges. However, there's some research that suggests that there are some pretty profound things that you can discover about people's mental state from relatively simple behaviours online. There was a paper published a couple of years ago looking at the use of Instagram filters as a predictor of depression, for example. Now, it turns out that one Instagram filter is strongly predictive of depressive symptoms. If you're a regular Instagram user, you'll probably guess that it's the black and white filter. People use it more and more and it increases in use. That's very strongly predictive of depression. There's also a whole load of changes in the language that people use when they are in various mental states. So, for example, again, people who are anxious use very different language from relaxed people. So you can start to use the already proven techniques to build a baseline of what's going on in the organisation. I think in terms of the machine learning, that's more about modelling the organisation and then being able to predict the effects of change.
Okay, since we've mentioned most of the buzzwords today, I would like to add another one, which is quantum mechanics. And in quantum mechanics, there's this notion of observer-created reality, that the measurement process actually changes what you're measuring. And specifically when you were talking about the sentiment analysis over Slack, and I can imagine as a worker in some organization thinking that the top management is analyzing all my communication with everybody else for sentiment and for everything else, it would kind of affect how I feel. Maybe it would affect
negatively. Yeah, no, I agree. It's a big challenge. I think, yeah, the observer effects are quite considerable. The only, well, there are some protections against it. The first one is actually building a culture of trust in the organisation. Like any IT project or any IT tool, this is only a tool, it's a lever. And if you've got an organisation that's going wrong, it'll help the organisation go wrong faster and more spectacularly than if it hadn't implemented it. I'm sure we've all seen projects in organisations where if they hadn't done whatever they did, they might still be muddling along, but they're not anymore. The other thing is that you can give people some ownership of what they're sharing. So in the same way that some social media is now trying to shift towards giving people a greater ownership of their own data, you can start to let people only share data when they feel it's in their interest to do so. So you can get, so if you've got quite personal data, it's only available to the individual and they can use it for their own reflection and development rather than making it available to the wider organisation. And there's still quite a lot of value in aggregating that data and then reflecting it back. So if you can think about maybe an inter-team level or an interdepartmental level in a large organisation, there's far less risk there than personally being exposed as behaving in a certain way.
Following on from that, from a GDPR perspective,
yeah.
do you need to consent the users to capture that data for the kind of automated processing, sentiment analysis?
Yes, definitely. The challenge, I think, for a lot of organisations is actually aligning their GDPR for their staff. I've noticed this, that the DPA covers employees as much as it covers customers, and very few organisations seem to really be taking that as seriously as they are taking their customer commitments. But no, I agree entirely, and we need to get to the place at which it's normal for all of the data that's collected about employees to be presented to employees right at the front of the organisation as part of their employment contract. There's a lot being collected, and just because we're running machine learning against something doesn't mean that the data isn't already there. In many cases, you've got retention policies on an Exchange server, for example, that are running through and rule matching emails and keeping them for potentially 10, 15 years. And very few people really are fully aware that that's what's going on in their mailboxes. And they might be moved off to a different archive, so they might be completely unaware that it's even happened. There's a big challenge there around the DPA and employee stuff. I do wonder whether once we've got more comfortable with the implications of GDPR for customers, then the focus will then move more internally to the organisation.
Yeah, I guess the problem is that, most organisations, I guess, are used to, most people who work for large organisations are used to the idea that the internet usage is monitored and recorded, who they phone, not necessarily the content, but who they phone is recorded, emails are saved, and then there'll be some sort of quite vague general statements about this information is stored to protect the organisation and look for breaches of policy and whatever. But it's quite a big step change, isn't it, to on one hand look and see when I sent you an email saying you're an arsehole, that's very sort of binary. Yeah. And somebody digging deep into the sort of the nuances of what my email says, to the extent that I might not realise that I'm giving away the fact that I'm depressed because I'm using certain filters. Yeah. Because that's not something I know. It's the same thing that you talk to, you go to a party and talk to a psychiatrist and say, "Oh, hi Michael, how are you?" Fine. Because you're worried that they can interpret your words much more than you intended. Yeah. And so how do you deal with that? Because most policies and GDPR or not, companies will say, we can use your data to ensure policies are being met or something, or procedures are being followed. Yeah. And that could actually hide an absolute multitude of quite insidious, invasive analysis. No, it's very true. If organisations aren't using this in the fundamental interests of their employees, then those organisations have a problem.
That's one of the first things. And I know that represents many organisations, but that is a fundamental problem. As I said, you know, you are giving people more insight into the way that the organisation is working. And there's an interesting theory of management which suggests that quite often organisations work because they have poor information flows. And that actually protects the frontline staff from the bureaucracy, because they can get on with their work and their management don't always find out what's actually going on, so they carry on in blissful ignorance. Now, if that's true and an organisation adopts this kind of technology, they're going to suffer. What I would say is that hopefully you can use this kind of technology to understand why that is a problem and then reorient the organisation around something more effective and more positive.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the danger, isn't it? It's the same argument about guns.
Yeah.
You know, a gun's a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you use it.
Yeah, it's a powerful. It is powerful. I think one of the unanswered questions about this kind of technology is how much can we find out about people, and where is that data available to us? You know, even looking at, say, I mean, the Instagram stuff is public. That research was done on public feeds, so that data is just out there, and that's not to say all the public data that people have across every other service as well. So if you aggregate that, there's a huge amount of data out there. And I'm not sure that of all of its well-intentioned, that the GDPR was drafted up to the point at which it was drafted, and that was before this technology started to look really, really powerful. And it doesn't really cover these use cases of emergent information.
There's a debate, isn't there, about, I think GDPR's got some wording in it about AI.
Yeah.
And AI systems being able to explain their thinking.
Yeah.
And of course, they're not thinking.
No, and
it's just a pile of stats.
Well, you have two different models for AI. So you have an explicable model and an inexplicable model, a black box. And explicable models are great because we can understand them and understand how the thing came to its conclusions. But the inexplicable models are more powerful. They can spot deeper patterns and they can spot more complex patterns in things that just aren't really meaningful to a human. Even if it could surface the decisions that it had made, it wouldn't necessarily make sense to us as to why. I'm not an ethicist, but I am aware of some of the discussions around this. I think one of my favourite examples or favourite solutions was that we should hold organisations responsible for their AI and for tuning their AI in the interests of people, but not necessarily, if it's black box AI, for the specific outcomes. So accepting that there is some risk, but that the overall benefits are better. Sorry,
Yeah, a couple of minutes ago, a gentleman in front of me alluded to a hypothetical email where when you give away email someone else.
Your true feelings, yeah.
Yes, because of the filters. Now, isn't this actually part of the endemic problem? Surely, if organisations and people within them are to improve and progress, it doesn't need to be hidden. It shouldn't be hidden.
No.
Depressed. So it's surely a big cultural issue that needs to be addressed before anything else meaningful can happen, that people can be open and candid about that.
I agree entirely. I think one of the things I'm really interested in is psychological safety in organisations. It's telling that many organisations have absolutely rigorous physical health and safety. You know, someone slips over on the stairs and there's 3 forms to fill in and an inquiry. Yet, work can drive people to some very dark places and no one really notices or bats an eyelid. And when it's raised, it's not seen as a consequence of the work environment. It is very, very hard to track. And one of the things that I'm interested in doing with this kind of technology is actually being able to start understanding the processes that give rise to this. Because it's not well understood, they're complex processes. But I agree entirely, I'd really like to see psychological safety and mental well-being at work much, much higher up the agenda.
Sorry. You just touched on mental well-being, and it's something that's coming more to the fore. Is there any take on how systems, and especially the analysis one, deals with people who don't respond in the normal fashion to stress and such like? I'm going to mix, very early on you mentioned people in the city, working in the City of London, financial sectors. And if you mix that with the perceived, if not proven, fact that a lot of these people actually are Asperger's based or suffer from, how do you analyse people who don't respond in the norm and take into account the fact that there's a story out about a year ago now that 250,000 people left the workplace in the past decade because their mental welfare wasn't being taken care of? Because you're measuring flawed responses.
Yes. No, you have to be extremely careful about not being very normative with the conclusions that you come to. The flip side of this is that surfacing some of this stuff actually could have a significant help for non-neurotypical people. We have a particular challenge in IT that very often the best practitioners are promoted to management positions.
Well, they're least suited.
And IT is not a profession until you reach management that selects for social skills. It just doesn't, in the way that something like sales does, where you actually have to be able to relate to people. And giving these newly promoted managers a set of tools that help scaffold the development of those social skills is actually potentially a very powerful thing. But I take your point completely. We have to be very careful that we're not training in biases when we're training in data sets. We've seen huge mistakes already made with that, and not training in neurotypical expectations is one of the really big challenges.
That non-typical exists probably more in IT than some other industries. Because the tendencies or the traits actually fit the model. Or that they're well fitted to the workflows that are needed and the sort of rigours of that work.
Yes, indeed. And I think as a young profession, IT has also been more tolerant of some of the more less conventional behaviour associated with some of those neurotypes. And I'm not just thinking about people who are potentially approaching the autistic spectrum. I'm also thinking about people at the other end. I have many dyslexic colleagues and many other colleagues who are far from neurotypical. And that's to IT's credit as a profession, I think. I think that's actually a really positive thing. But you're right, we need to make sure that we preserve that value and support people in being better at integrating with others.
I had a comment on whether dyslexics would fit in well or badly to some of the IT work. I never thought about that one, to be honest.
The cliched descriptions of the two neurotypes are that people on approaching the autistic spectrum can tend to be very detail oriented and tend to be bottom-up thinkers. They're extremely good at focusing on repetitive tasks and doing things bit by bit. Dyslexics, on the other hand, are top-down thinkers. So they're very good at systematization and understanding big complexity and never getting anywhere near the detail. So if you can combine those two in a way that works together, you have something extremely powerful, but only if you can combine those two.
It almost comes back to building teams of not the same, but different.
Yes, complementary skills.
Complement each other's skill
sets.
And I think it's something we've probably shied away from recently, because people tend to build of their own types.
It's really interesting when we see things like support swarming. We see these more modern development methods where you'll get someone kind of customer facing and someone who's a career developer and someone who's representing the business and a whole range of different roles which you would assume probably have relatively different personality archetypes associated with those roles, and how successful that's been for some organisations, but how challenging as well. Getting those teams to work together cohesively is extremely hard.
Keeping them together could be equally hard.
Yeah, indeed.
Sorry,
Sorry, I've got someone just behind you. Sorry, you haven't asked a question yet, so I'll come back to you.
Question about kind of the level of intervention or interaction with these techniques. So, at what level interaction is typically quite intervention in terms of directly talking to people, or a lot of what you talked about here is analytics?
Yeah.
The kind of other end of the scale, just taking an example of, say, line management or management role, is the higher level, system level linking or metrics. So what I mean by that is, for example, say if you have a management structure and you have an office structure, you could probably work out that it's not possible for the people you're line managing, other people, to find a private space to have a conversation.
Yeah.
And you might have a lot of benefit to the organisation to say, oh, by the way, there's no space, maybe, and then that doesn't need the automation coming in and helping at the lowest levels. It's more a case of saying, here's the things that are bad signs, and then the fix ends up being done by a human, and that has a better global effect in trying to improve point-to-point automation, or point-to-point interaction.
Definitely, no, I agree entirely. A lot of the value of this stuff is in surfacing and measuring things that previously have been completely intangible. You know, it's about being able to present a dashboard that can be measured, you know, that can, so you can actually measure things. I mean, I think it's Peter Drucker, isn't it? What gets measured gets managed. And one of the problems with social systems and culture and a positive work environment is that everyone feels it, everyone understands it when they go to work, but there's no score, there's just no way to really track it. And when you ask employees, how happy are you at work, you can set up a very difficult demand characteristic. So you've got, you know, say you've got a fairly dysfunctional workplace and suddenly they want everyone to be happy. So they're asking everyone, you know, how happy are you? And if you say, I'm not very happy, then there are consequences, either collective or individual. That's really a big issue. So we haven't really been able to track these intangible things until this point. It's very valuable.
I've got a bigger question. I mean, isn't our looking at more positive? Do you think we'll ever get to a stage we'll have personal sentiment checkers on our Outlook, the same as we've got spell checkers, like on our orange squiggly, the sentiment, just to track it before you put your foot in it?
Yes. Yes, I do.
Like, it's totally a great feature. I mean, why don't we do it?
Yeah, it's hard to do because you have to understand the context of a conversation. To some extent, if you think about, you know, the kind of emails you send and people sending single liners. But no, I agree entirely. I think a tone check is definitely something that should be invented soon. There's all sorts of different models that could work with this. There's, for example, there's a psychology approach called transactional analysis, which you may have come across. It says that people interact as parent, adult, or child, and they can interact at either of those angles, either of those directions. And quite often management conversations fail when they turn into that parent-child thing, that authoritarian, I'm telling you how you should do something. So if you have a tone check on the email that says, perhaps you want to rephrase that, perhaps you don't want to put it in that way, then yeah, I agree, there's huge value in that. There's huge value in all of these analytics, in fact. You know, if you go big, you know, far off into the future and go into augmented reality, you know, the ability to support non-neurotypical people in reading body language and facial expressions, for example, is hugely valuable. So you can get feedback, you know, you could say someone on the autistic spectrum, they could actually get feedback about what someone was thinking as, you know, in the way that we would all naturally read it, that they don't get naturally.
And yet, if they can't do it on the desktop, does it really work if it's hidden? I mean,
Yeah, I think it's important for transparency too, that people can see how the stuff is being judged. Sorry, you've got.
My main point was once all this data is collected and analysed, what's the duty of care of the employer to act upon the data to say you look like you're depressed, what can you do about it? Or your work is causing you to be stressed, what can you do about it? And what could that data be used for example, employment tribunals or things like that?
Yeah, no, you're right. It's potentially, it does have consequences for an employer to start collecting this kind of data. Yeah, I think you're right. I think employers do have a duty of care. The question is whether this surfaces things that they wouldn't want to be seen. You know, we've spoken about the employee potentially wanting things to stay hidden. But you're right, there's also the possibility that the employer might want things to stay hidden too. I agree entirely.
Once you start to extrapolate this from the perspective of information you're collecting, so we're talking about simple chat and Slack. You've got people with Fitbits, you can collect heart rate information, you can have cameras around the office, you can have tracking software, you can collect an awful lot of far more interesting information to start to build these pictures from. Yeah.
No, you're right. When you start to collect physiological data as well, it can be incredibly telling. You know,
it's a much better indicator of somebody being stressed than what they say in Slack.
Yeah, indeed.
Stressed.
It's the correlation of the two that is really powerful. The more data that you have feeding in, from different sources. But no, you're right entirely.
But surely, if you start gathering in these super data sets, then the employer finds themselves spending more time having psychological issues flagged up to them that they know in their duty of care they now have to deal with, rather than the employer just saying, look, I know you're my boss, but I'm feeling a bit fed up, and then triggering some sort of intervention. Now suddenly you get this almost automated effect where by 10 o'clock when you're fired off that second email that says you're an arsehole, you suddenly got HR coming down with the contract to take you away.
No,
you just sent an email to your colleague who you've called an arsehole for the past 30 years.
Yeah, and it's just part of the relationship. Yeah, this is the subtlety of this. This is why it's challenging. I agree entirely. But a good organisation shouldn't behave like that in that kind of disempowering, remote kind of employees as subjects of the bureaucracy way. That doesn't work. However, a lot do, and if they adopt this, you're right, that will happen. Sorry.
It's just a point around everything we're talking about as being the actual stressors. So I use Slack at work. I'm not an IT person. I'm like an infiltrator here. And I think it could cause burnout in itself. It's an information overload. So if you have considerations around, similar to the question back there, what employers should do to come to you to say, actually, I think we might be overloading, and same with monitoring and advising on the email. It's kind of, that's what causes people to just burn out in itself.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think one of the reasons to monitor this stuff is to look for the effect that it has on people and to monitor when it starts to go wrong. If you get people logging in at 3 a.m. regularly to check their email, someone should be asking people why. They should.
I might get asked why. If I make a reply at half-time in the evening, my manager will say to me, "What were you doing on Slack at half-time?"
Which is a good thing. We want work-life balance. We need to rest and recover. We can't just work. The flip side is that you also need to be flexible and let people work flexibly. I'm all for letting people work in whatever method suits them best. I think the regular 9 to 5 definitely doesn't suit people, and there's a lot of research suggesting that it suits millennial employees even less. I agree. I think being able to flag to people themselves that they might want to consider something is perhaps the most valuable part of this before it goes anywhere else. Maybe it never goes anywhere else. It's just you have a little traffic light that goes to amber saying, perhaps you want to consider working, taking a break, that kind of thing. Sorry.
Maybe this is a good question to follow your question about duty of care. what are your thoughts on when the benefits to the individual or the group within the company don't necessarily align with the benefits to the company?
Yeah.
I'll give you a little example we've spoken about quite a bit at Product Forge about how on an individual level you quite often advise not to start companies with your best friends or family because it's a high risk.
Yes.
But there's the most successful startup accelerator in the US, Y Combinator, it's a predictor of success if you start companies with your friends from college. Because
interesting. Okay.
So they're optimizing for the chances of success of the company, whereas on an individual level, you should really maybe be optimizing at least more so towards your relationships with your closest friends and family.
So you're saying that effectively, it sounds like because there could be potential consequences down the line for the relationship, something like Y Combinator, where they're looking for groups of friends, could be gets a more likely return on its investment whilst putting those relationships potentially at risk.
Yeah, or on an organisational level, you might have a high level of burnout, but potentially with the culture that you're operating, the result that you're operating, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I just think maybe...
You mean that people join and then leave, or
yeah,
that people kind of work through the organisation?
Just maybe following on from the duty of care question, what are your thoughts on when the care for the individual in every aspect doesn't necessarily align with the benefits to the company? Because I think it would maybe be naive to think that everything's going to align perfectly.
Yeah, it is really difficult, and it's an ongoing tension. I think one of the things is that hiring processes should be looking for more aligned individuals, and should be one of the other uses of being able to track and understand how your organisation really works, is that you're more able to identify people ahead of time who might well work successfully in that organisation.
Yeah.
But people's needs change, organisations' needs change. I think being on a change orientation, managing it both personally and organisationally is the key, but the expectation that you'd necessarily stay with an organisation for a long time, I don't see that as the case, though there is some research to suggest that stable teams are the most effective. You know, a well-formed team that's been together for a long time works really, really well together. And so there is value in that. You want to aim for that, but you don't want to force it. But you're right, again, there's another tension there potentially between the employee and the employer. As an employee, we're moving to this situation where we're kind of expected to manage our careers in a very different way. You know, you can't give over to the employer the expectation that they give you a career path anymore. That's not what we're seeing in most organisations. We're seeing, you know, people expecting to have their LinkedIn profile sorted and find new opportunities, and we're seeing that job changes are getting more regular. You know, people are changing job more and more often, and so there is an element of kind of knowing yourself and managing your own needs. Potentially there's a kind of consumer, employee version of this that helps you understand yourself and your context better, so you can make better decisions in the future about who you should be working with. Because, I mean, ultimately organisations are just a big collection of people. You know, they are, and aligning the needs of that big collection of people as much as possible is in the interests of all those people. But it's a very hard problem, and you're right, there are, when you get funding and you get external forces, there are potentially tensions created there.
Basically, you can't say that when we live in a goldfish bowl, where effectively all our emotions only we analyse, know who we are. But organisations are really quite dysfunctional.
Yeah.
There are very few good organisations there, and in certain bits this is almost kind of like a technological crutch. So they don't have to actually change their culture, because effectively you can do it quite easily just by talking to your staff or talking to your manager.
Yep.
We have interacted for centuries, but it's something more attractive about actually using a tool which does it without us being aware of it. But then the consequence of that is, the fact is that you're right, that it could be turned against you. Someone could be turned around and sort of saying, well, looks like it's on the cusp of having a breakdown. Maybe we should let him go at this point of time. You know, it's been like, you know, the glass ceiling, you know, don't employ women because they may get pregnant, you know. So if you're not careful, these very tools which are supposed to give us a degree of freedom, the illusion of freedom, actually end up being in our cage.
Yeah, no, it could be, you're right, it could be very dangerous. But someone is developing these, you know, people are developing these kind of things. That data is out there. From my point of view, what I would like to see is that companies which have a positive focus on organisational development and human potential are the ones that win, rather than the companies that are interested in cost minimisation, or selling, you know, optimising on the basis of cost minimisation and basically extracting as much out of people as possible and then just casting them aside. That's the only assurance I can give. I mean, I think it is a genuine risk for all of this stuff. Yeah, I agree.
There's many organisations like that. Even if you look at Facebook, Google, these
Yeah.
organisations are supposed to be fantastic for people. And a lot of the issues recently coming out about how their policies are produced.
Yeah.
So you mentioned about the gun and who uses it. But effectively, are we sort of giving our employers a submachine gun to basically work out what we're doing? And I know the cat's out of the bag, but effectively as IT people, we're going to continue developing this. I know people in Google refuse to work on projects related to the military.
Yeah.
But this has a more effect on society than anything.
Potentially it does. It does have ethical implications. I think the ethical implications of AI are huge, particularly once it crosses the threshold to be able to calculate things that look more than human. You know, to make judgments that no human could understand, even if it were made explicable to them. Yeah, it is a challenge. From my point of view, the best protection against that is a healthy organisation that's actually run on positive lines in the first place, and making things transparent and making people be able to see what the what the system's view about the person and feed it back to them before it shares anything like that with anyone else.
So for decades we've been moving away from that kind of organisation. For decades we've been moving across and actually putting the burden on the employer. So no longer do you have a career path, you have to do it yourself.
Yeah.
On top of doing your job, you have to juggle your career, you have to be on LinkedIn, have a profile, have a start here, there and everywhere.
Yeah.
And manage your social media profile. So you look good, you know, and obviously not do a Kim Kardashian and take 10,000 selfies to get the right one. But effectively, the organisations, they'll put that onto the individual.
Yeah. Yeah, no, they do. It's been a big shift. Whether that's a good thing or not, yeah. It gives people more freedom, gives people more opportunity to not end up stuck with the same organisation that wasn't a good fit for them in the first place, but was the first one they came across at the start of their career. But the flip side of that is, yeah, it can have some serious consequences. I think, you know, there's some wider stuff, and this is probably something for the BCS to start discussing and potentially working with government on, about how these kind of things are positioned and used and managed at that societal level, because you're right, they could have really serious consequences.
In the same way that you can build a neural network to mess with a categorizing neural network, so there's what's the minimum change, I need to make this picture of a dog so it comes out as a pear, or something like that. How hard are these to gain, and then which side's the law going to come down on? Is the tool or the tool to break the tool going to be the first one I'm not allowed to have?
That's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought of subverting them. It would be possible, because you could easily run through, if you know what the rules are, you can cheat. Yeah.
And I will.
Yeah. Yeah. So no, that's a really interesting idea. Yeah. I don't know. It's going to be down to organisations to try and police that if they want to.
Yeah. In the same way, isn't there a safeguard when organisations gathering this data that possibly when they not do this in the future, one of them will be hauled up because they had the data to save someone but didn't implement it?
It's entirely possible. It is entirely possible that will happen.
You knew that this person was heading for whatever
and didn't intervene.
Yeah.
You already see some Dutch universities. As universities increasing mental health risk amongst students and so forth, and we're using learning analytics and so to identify who's maybe struggling with the course and what the ethical implications in there, how much data to collect, how much to put in, how to put it in, and trying to do that when students do self-harm or something like that. Then there's the question of how much, given the data we've got, should be intervened in the first place. So it's, I think if you actually look at what's happening in the ethical questions around learning analytics and student health, you see quite some of this already beginning to be out there.
So are you suggesting that somebody could be accused as an employer or as a university of neglect by not doing this analysis?
Certainly there is pressure on universities to do more to support their students at the moment. If you extrapolate that, it could be the case that, well, this person, suppose somewhere in the student commits suicide and what's happened, and then sort of everyone knew this person wasn't very good in classes, they had been sort of voluntary, why didn't you send someone down to see if they were right?
Yeah, I know of one large data analytics company that's selling into universities exactly on that basis. It's a big thing, and universities are motivated to get as many students through their courses as possible. Dropouts are very expensive. So aside from anything else, aside from the human cost, I don't know whether anyone's really tracking emotional state directly or assuming that academic performance is correlated with emotional state. And therefore then looking for signs that like dropout risk factors rather than, say, depression risk factors, if you see what I mean.
I think that type of stuff is incredibly interesting. The danger with, I think some of the points there were when you get to false positives. Especially maybe not here, but more of a digital society.
Got to handle false positives. Yeah, sorry.
I work in quite a collaborative team, but I've got one team member I'm thinking about who actually finds that collaboration a little bit uncomfortable. Just naturally is a bit more introspective, for example. And I'm just thinking of the kind of workplace that you're describing here, where the communications have been analysed at a sort of secondary level for reasons. And I actually think that would actually cause them stress.
That's interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and I'm actually wondering, going back to the number, I actually wonder if this is geared towards certain types of personality who are much more open, and personalities that aren't. The actual environment itself might be harmful, even unintentionally.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I think it's down to the organisation to try and set a team context that works for all the members of the team, but there will be tension there. And yeah, we have, one of the other wide ranges in IT is we tend to skew introverted as a profession. And that can be a really big challenge. And I think if you're measuring a handful of interactions, if someone's very introverted and they tend to be very inwardly focused, they're actually not going to have that many interactions. You're going to have a very small data set with which to understand them. So you do have a higher chance of false positives with a small data set, aside from anything else.
Hire people almost at the formation of the agile kind of whole movement.
Yeah.
It was a really interesting thing where you had people who were naturally introverted and historically had been, and suddenly the kind of culture was no. It's almost extroverted behaviours we're now looking for, and that brought sort of challenges.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if this is almost at the next level. But
no, I think, one of the things this is about support. One of the things is about supporting agile teams and distributed teams. They're hard to support with conventional management practices, and we've yet to find some really good answers. I think there's a huge amount of potential in agile approaches, but fitting that into the wider organisational context is often very, very difficult. But you're right, there's also the case of maintaining the skills that we have and fitting people for whom that's a very challenging work environment to be in. Yeah, definitely.
Can I just come back to that one? Because I think, don't have data to prove this, that the move towards sort of smarter workplaces, the use of Skype, email, and all the other always-on messaging systems actually doesn't fit terribly well for some people who are A, introverted, or B, don't fit neurological standards, because they find the change, or that constant transition from one to the other itself actually very, very stressful.
I think it probably affects everyone negatively, honestly. I think there's a good case for more focused work. We need to orient around. Again, this is a question of we're effectively giving kind of management and other people power over our schedule. And I don't know if you've come across the maker's schedule versus the manager's schedule. This idea that people who, managers, their day is very much divided up into hours because that's a meeting. So you've got meeting after meeting after meeting, and that's the way that their whole schedule works. Whereas makers, if you're doing focused work, you're writing or you're coding, you actually need quite a long time to build that model and to understand exactly what you're doing before you can make any progress. That's as I mentioned, the mental model thing. And the maker schedule is much more like 3 hours, 4 hours in a chunk. And so if you have a meeting at 11 and you have a meeting at 2:30, you have no chance to do your most productive work. And it's a big challenge for organisations. I mean, I think the expectation that something like Slack is real time is a problem. It should be available for real time if necessary. But whenever you've got an organisation that's expecting people to respond and respond and respond, if they are actually producing output, you're going to reduce that output.
Oh yes, that's easily seen.
It is. It's easily seen, but
even if it's not realised.
And again, this is another thing that's potentially measurable. That if people get a lot of messages and interruptions, and then their work output drops off, and you can intervene, but it's one of those things that is invisible to many managers because they don't see the context of the work being interrupted.
But also when we solve that, there's this myth that the fact you need to be experts at Slack, you need to be real time. If you're not doing that, it's a bit like having a young daughter, you've got all these images, and you've got to look this way, this way. And it's the same in the workplace these days. The fact is we're in a high-tech world, everything's got to be high-tech, and the fact that actually get off your seat and go and talk to someone when you can just Skype them or Slack them is now seen to be more the way to go. And it's then uniformly applied. When we already talk about when individuals being not typical, it's something uniformly applied, all these tools. And then there all seems to be a new tool come along. Just as you get used to one, there's another one. And notifications.
But doesn't that mean you get better messaging then? So one of the things is if you walk up to my desk, knock on my desk, that's right behind phoning me as I want your attention now, and you're not getting away without me. Whereas Slack is a bit higher up the status than email. I can ignore an email all day, but Slack, I'm going to get itchy after about an hour and a half and I have to know what you said. But now, if you know what the message is, you've got a model of what the person that's sending is like, you send a message that's appropriate to that person. So you Slack managers and you email someone who's potentially in a flow state, gets an email saying, here's what happened in that 4 hours while you were away on planet holiday.
Yeah, and if you've got, physiological analytics, you can pretty much tell when someone's really focused on work, and, eye tracking is a particularly good way to measure that. As was mentioned earlier. So it's a really good point that you can actually turn these things to the individual's productivity and their advantage, in that they wouldn't get interrupted if they're not in the right.
That's only if the individual controls the data.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that's a key. That is a key aspect. It's going to be a big challenge about how you control that emergent data. But no, you're right. We've got to give individuals control over this stuff. Definitely.
More fashionable in your office, the managers or the techies? Because if this is the fashion, this is what we're all going to be using, whether we like it or not.
Well, this is it. It's usually it depends if you get a new manager in. Usually they come in, they've got their own ideas, they want to basically, and they're bringing a new tool. And in some respects you think, well, it does the same as the old tool. Why have we got this new tool? Oh, well, this is bigger and better. It's newer.
The really effective managers will use this to make their interpersonal interactions more effective. So if you've got more information, you use that to inform a better person-to-person conversation instead of a replacement.
Right.
They're the good managers.
I'm going to try and stop Matthew now.
Sorry.
He won't be at the start, he could talk for hours, and he's proving it as well.
Yeah.